Hello chess lovers. I'm going to show you a game here with which I won the 2017 South Carolina Championship. We're a small chess state. We don't have nearly as many players as other states, but it always means a lot to go out and to compete against your peers and your friends in the state. And it means a lot to me to win my home state championship for the first time. In this game, a lot of people told me they really liked the sharp, sacrificial style of the game. It kind of kicks back to the 1800s when this kind of play was really popular. I get to play the Evans Gambit in this game, which is an opening that's still played today, but it's really from an aggressive, romantic era of chess that's gone by. So I hope you enjoy this game as much as I enjoyed getting to play it. I started off here with white with 1e4. My opponent was an expert, I think about 2100, Jackie Lou from Florida here, and my opponent selected the move e5. A lot of times here, I like to go in with the King's Gambit. I actually play that surprisingly often, given that it's not a very good chess opening. I just enjoy the positions. I give them a shot. But in this case, I had not been able to prepare for the game because my last game went long, and there was a meeting before this game. But my opponent had had about an hour. I thought they would have been able to look up my games, maybe on chess.com or somewhere. They might have seen that I play the King's Gambit, and they might have prepared. If you're going to play the King's Gambit, you don't really want your opponent to be super prepared for it. So I decided to change it up a little bit. I played knight f3. My opponent decides to play knight c6. I played bishop c4. My opponent has the choice here, bishop c5 or knight f6, and they went bishop c5. So after a little thought here, I decided I was going to play pawn to e4, the Evans Gambit. I've enjoyed playing the Evans Gambit a few times. I like these kind of contests where you get to sacrifice the pawn, but you get some development, you get some central control, that kind of thing. So I felt like this would be kind of a fun game for me. Also, my opponent earlier had taken a draw, went up a pawn because the opponent had some pressure. I didn't think he should have taken the draw, and I kind of felt like my opponent was in general uncomfortable when there's pressure. So I thought sacrifice a pawn, get that pressure, see if he's going to be uncomfortable. I think it worked because he spent a lot of time after he took the pawn on his next couple of moves. I don't know a ton here, but I know c3, of course, the bishop has to move. And after the bishop retreats to a5, as it did in this case, or to any other square, I pretty much always am doing this. I'm going to play pawn d4. The pawn gets captured, and I'm going to castle. Now, if my opponent's really greedy, they can try to capture this pawn. But I really think that that's a disaster. A lot of times, you see some great games where black does this, and white just steamrolls the opponent. I'd really point you to the game Bobby Fischer versus Ruben Fine there. I think it's a casual blitz game or something like that, but Bobby wins in like 18 moves, and I think that that's the kind of recipe that black's dealing with when you get greedy and capture that pawn. It is not worth neglecting further development, neglecting castling to go after this pawn. So my opponent picks, I think, a good move here, knight f6. When someone sacrifices a pawn on you, one thing to remember is don't get too defensive. You still need to be aggressive yourself, right? Just because someone sacked a pawn doesn't mean you can't develop pieces with threats. So my opponent develops this knight to its best square, puts pressure on e4. Now I think I make my one mistake in the game. It's a short game, otherwise I would have made more mistakes. But because it's short, I only made one mistake, I think, right here, and I played bishop g5. I'm just trying to develop and increase the pressure, but this move just proves ineffective. It's not doing a lot. What I should have done is I should have come up and played e5. I don't usually like to do this because my center loses some flexibility. I want pawns on d4 and e4 that are flexible and controlling squares. I don't want to advance the pawn, but I think I have to here. Now, if my opponent moves the knight here with knight e4, I think they actually get into trouble. I come over and I attack that knight, bring the rook to the middle. Then they kind of need to go take on c3. And here, after a nice exchange, I can just move the queen that's attacked by the knight. I'm going to go get this pawn back. I'm still down some pawns, but I'm going to have amazing open lines. And black is going to have a lot of problems with the king. And the knight is going to be close to trapped here on c3. And in general, I just feel like black is in a lot of trouble. And the computer evaluation you can see is just increasing and increasing and increasing. Instead, it's possible to play pawn d5, and this is good for black. Well, this is okay for black. Black needs to do it. This is a really important idea. Stick it in your head, put it in your toolbox if you haven't seen this yet. When the pawn comes up and attacks a knight here, you can often play pawn to d5. Now, if the bishop just moves, the knight can safely go to e4. So white is pretty much compelled, I think, to capture. Black captures, you capture again, the rook has to move, and then we can develop the rook and then the bishop with gain of time, with check, and then with an attack on the queen. I think black can play this position, but it's got, you know, some risky elements, and I think it's interesting and complex for both sides. It's worth trying for white, and I think it was the correct choice for black in this position as well. So instead, when I came out here and pinned the knight, I'm threatening pawn e5, so my opponent plays the knight, the right move, pawn d6, stopping e5 and getting ready to get this bishop out. The most natural move in the world for me here is to take this pawn on d4. I get that perfect pawn center that I've always wanted, right? I love this pawn center, but here it's not so good. The problem is bishop g4 threatening to take here and then take here is actually really difficult to deal with. And you can see that black has an advantage. It's basically because of this bishop g4 idea. My center is coming under fire, and I just don't have any real flexibility to kind of initiate an attack. After a lot of thought, here, first castles for black, queen a4. I'm threatening d5, and then possibly queen takes a5. I'm also threatening pawn to e5. So I've got some threats. My opponent needs to figure out how to deal with them. It looks like the right way was just to pull this bishop back and bring more pressure on the center. I don't really have much for the pawn here, maybe nothing. But after bishop d7, I think I'm getting a little more counterplay. Even though the computer still says black is better, I think I put in a lot of time here, and I think I found the right move. I pull back with queen a3. I get out of the line where the bishop is attacking me. I'm still putting pressure on this bishop on a5, and I've got ideas of d5 and e5, both of which are kind of difficult for black to meet. So I'm feeling pretty good here. My opponent pulled back with bishop b6, and I went in with e5. Now, at this point, my opponent looks like they might be losing this knight, but those of you who are experienced players should recognize that when this pin is happening, you can break the pin with pawn h6 and pawn g5. You wreck your kingside pawn structure, which is important to your king's safety, but you are going to be able to save the piece by counterattacking this bishop. The right way for my opponent to do it is to trade on e5 first. I take back, keeping this pin, and then there's pawn h6 attacking the bishop, and instead of this and then g5 to break the pin, it looks like the best continuation might just be this. Black is forced to write the pawn structure this way, producing doubled isolated pawns on the king side and a permanently weak king on g8. The computer says black is still better here. Maybe. I don't have hours to spend analyzing this position, but I feel really good about white's chances, and I suspect that objectively white has got at least enough compensation in this position. In any case, I'd certainly be happy to play this position. Instead, after I came up here with pawn e5, my opponent, I think, made the decisive mistake in the game. My opponent just took on d4. The idea here for my opponent is he wants to get 3 pawns for the piece. He's going to give up the knight on f6. He's hoping to get 3 pawns. I think that even if it worked, it would be a bad decision, because in the middle game, when I've got attacking chances, that piece is worth way more than those 3 pawns. In the end game, we can rediscuss it. Maybe the 3 pawns would be valuable, but we're in the middle game. My piece is going to be a much more useful piece than the pawns he's going to get. The second problem is just tactically, I have some really big threats that prevent him from even kind of getting the material exchanges that he wants. So I'm going to pause the computer analysis for a moment. I'm going to advance the position. I take here, my opponent takes back, I come up with bishop h6. Okay, I'm attacking this rook, but I don't even want this rook. The bigger thing is that I'm creating threats over here against the king. My opponent drops knight c2 in. Now I have to move the queen, and I pick the square queen c3. Of course, knight c2 was threatening both my rook and my queen. My opponent follows through, taking the rook. And now here's where I think my opponent just assumed that I would take the knight, or that I would need to go take the knight in a moment, and he didn't look for more alternatives, okay? I'm gonna ask you to look for more alternatives, so pause the video here and see if you can find the best move for white. There are many good moves, but there is one best move. Okay, we're going on now, and I'm going to assume that most of you, maybe all of you, found the correct move. Okay, whoops. The correct move here, flipping the engine back on, is knight to e5. The thing about knight e5 is that we're threatening queen g3 check and queen g7 mate. And the thing about that is that you really can't stop it. It's a crushing threat. In fact, after a few seconds, the computer evaluation just shoots up, and we see that we have a plus 16. So black is forced to just discard tons of material with no real hope of benefiting from it. The reason we have to pick knight e5 to create this threat of queen to g3, queen g7 mate, is because if we move the knight somewhere else, like knight h4, we're threatening queen g3 and queen g7 mate, but our opponent can escape it with the move king h8, meeting queen g3 with rook g8, saving the game, okay? And in fact, black would be better here if I really went for this and suddenly realized I cannot mate and everything I've done is wrong, okay? But now let me back up and let me show you one other line here before we continue. Another move that I see a lot of students recommend is knight to g5. This is actually a good example of hope chess. So if you kind of landed on this a little quickly and you settled on this move, you didn't think further here, note that black does not have to take the knight and allow the mate. And when you realize black isn't going to take this knight, actually the knight move is a problem for white because we're blocking this G line. And so here black can defend. The computer points out bishop f5 as a defense, okay? But after knight e5, the problem for black is that king over to h8, queen to g3, threatening mate, the only move, rook g8 to defend, knight to f7. So we needed to move the knight to e5 to get access to f7 here, and this is just checkmate, right? After knight e5, my opponent played bishop f5, but then there's queen g3 check, and my opponent resigned. What he realized was his whole idea of moving the bishop, and he didn't have anything better, was to retreat it here to g6, but I'm just going to take on g6, and when the pawn captures, I still take because there's a pin here. My opponent isn't able to capture my queen. The only legal move is over, and I have queen g7 checkmate. Okay, so my opponent resigned here after I gave this queen check, and fortunately for me, with a half-point lead, that was enough to win the South Carolina Championship. I had a lot of fun playing this game. I've had fun since looking at it with friends, and I know some people have told me they liked just seeing this kind of aggressive attack. So I hope you enjoyed it too. If you did, check me out on Twitter, check me out on YouTube, or check out one of my Twitch streams and connect in some way. And hopefully I'll see you again online at some point.